welcome in Go Big 12 or Go Home. I'm Brandon Shanahan, joined as always by Iowa broadcasting legend Drew Russell. Drew, what a week, man! What a week. I'm exhausted, to be honest with you. I'm pretty tired.
Did something happen this last weekend that's got everybody up in an upheaval? Did something happen?
So something happened. Honestly, but so again, I get into it. We got the college football rankings, the final edition release, so we know who's going to be in the playoff, who's not going to be in the playoff, who got hosed, who did not get hosed, who got the benefits of the conference that they play in, and who got in based on merit, and who got in based on marketing, lobbying, fiscal reasons. That is all known now. And if I'm being honest, Russell, I when Alabama won on Saturday, I was afraid that they would leave Texas out. As we're a Big 12 podcast. We got a Big 12 lean to it. We're very passionate about the league. I thought that they were going to find a way to be like, hey, yes, Texas did beat Alabama by 10 points in their home stadium. But, they just beat Georgia. They're one of the 4 best teams in the country. So that's where I thought it was going to go. And then that, fear kind of eased down as the day went on. And then Florida State played, and they won because they're a really good football team. And that's what really good football teams do. They're on the third quarterback, still win a conference championship. Still, first, not only did they cover the spread against Louisville, they also covered the spread against Florida with their backup quarterback, covered the spread in a game mostly played by their backup quarterback 2 weeks ago. So they're winning games by bigger margins than expected, despite not having Jordan Travis, who, by the way, is evidently so valuable that he, derailed the whole season for Florida State by getting injured, but is also not a Heisman finalist. So I guess he's not that valuable in the eyes of voters. But they won. Their defense was awesome. They aren't going to light up the scoreboard, but also Michigan didn't either. And there's no thought about them getting left out. In fact, you could say that Florida State had a better game than Michigan did. And Louisville is ranked higher than the team that Michigan played. So I don't know how you can look at that and be like, oh, well, this team shouldn't be in the college football playoff. However, it's not up to me, Drew Russell. As you know, it's up to a small committee filled with college administrators, former coaches, 0 people who do football full time. It's just a couple of administrators for universities. But they decided they know. So that's where we're at.
That is where we're at, isn't it? It's just we're going to go down a lot of different rabbit holes in this episode because there's a lot to break down in general. Number one, this is the Big 12 podcast. We do have a Big 12 representative who I know will not be in the conference next year, but Texas is in the playoffs.
For the Big 12. They won a Big 12 championship.
That is a Big 12 championship. Brent Yormark, he got the booze rained down on him on Saturday. Shout out to our guy Steve Sarkisian. He tried to, rein him in a little bit, but you weren't going to stop Texas fans. They were going to boo.
No, and also quick shout out to Yormark for sitting in it and enjoying it. There was another sticky situation up north with the Big Ten. Tony Petitti, who recently suspended Jim Harbaugh for the toughest stretch of their season after getting peer pressured by the coaches in his league, and he did not. He was like, "Hey, Joel Klatt, you can give him the trophy. You can present to you the master of ceremonies." Now that might have been planned. I don't know how charismatic Tony Petitti is compared to Brett Yormark, but shout out Brett. He had some harsh words about Texas and Oklahoma throughout the season, and awkward moment, but he stood tall.
He embraced those boos, and so we do have a Texas a Texas Longhorn team that's in, which pretty much the moment Alabama beat Georgia, I thought, all right, well, there's no way they're keeping, put Alabama in and Texas out. So you kind of felt like you knew that they were going to make the playoff. A great season, one that, non-conference scheduling helped them. Clearly, that might have been something that really helped them get in. Kind of good timing this year to play Bama on the road, a Bama team that, to put bluntly, first month of the season looked horrible. And even in parts of the later part of the season didn't look too good at
Yeah,
times.
I'd say Thanksgiving weekend, they also looked pretty horrible. But
Didn't gonna say,
it's a game I watched. I don't think the committee watched that game, but
tough to
you know,
say.
I did. We
Auburn,
did. True wrestling. We watched every minute of that game.
only lost. Auburn only lost by 21 to New Mexico State the week
Yeah.
before, but almost got a victory the next week against a Bama team. That's, it is what it is, right? I don't know what else to say, but I will say this, Brandon. It was good timing for Texas at that time. They took advantage. They had a good Big 12 regular season slate. No shame in the Oklahoma loss. Had a couple close calls, but on Saturday did what they were supposed to do and beat an Oklahoma State team that had 3 tiers their season where they had a really bad start, played a month and a half of extremely good football, and then the last 3 weeks, really 4 weeks to be honest, were lost and didn't play even remotely their best football. Still a great season though. They got a good bowl game. We'll get into that in the later. Just in terms of this all though, Brandon, it's amazing how it played out. We talked a little bit about it last week. What if we get a scenario where Bama beats Georgia and all the favorites win? And that's exactly what we got.
This was that chaos scenario.
This was the chaos scenario that I was like, if this happens, what do they do? And we got it. I couldn't believe we got it. That Washington beats Oregon. They were near 10-point dogs. They found a way to get a victory. You couldn't keep them out. Michigan pretty much was a shoe-in, and they were against the team that looked pretty helpless. I even had one Iowa fan text me and said, I thought their offense wasn't that bad, which tells you everything you need to know. That's not a joke. They were like, it could have been worse. They could have been worse. And I didn't fight it.
I believe it, yeah.
And then you get a victory for Florida State over Louisville. I'm not saying it was the prettiest game of all time, but they did what they had to do. They muddied it up. They had more yards of offense than Michigan did against Iowa. That's a factual statement. So you get those
you also got to realize that Michigan's without their star center, the real anchor of that team, since the Ohio State game. I think they're a totally different ball team now without him. Of course, that's just my opinion. Obviously, not the opinion of the 13 college administrators who are deciding the fate of college football. Didn't factor that in. Oddly enough, haven't factored that in the 10 years of playoff selections. Oddly enough, it's December. Every team has injuries, but something I noticed.
It literally was a nightmare scenario for the committee in terms of what to do with the SEC because the Bama wins, Texas wins, and a lot of people, myself included, Saturday afternoon going into the night, I'm thinking on paper, Florida State wins. They can't put an SEC team in.
No,
there's no way. It doesn't make sense. And they did, and I kind of initially thought, I think this is a done deal. But then this was before that game was played. I watched the Fox pregame show, and I was shocked when they're like, well, Florida State's out no matter what. And I'm thinking, man, there is like legit cohesiveness there. And then Sunday morning, late Saturday night, Sunday morning, watching a little ESPN. Wow, there is some bizarre cohesiveness here. Like, Bama's going to make it and Florida State's out. And I thought, this is a Power 5 champ. And this isn't exactly a pushover in Florida State either. It's not a no-name school. It's a team that's won multiple national championships. And for this to go down the way it did, Brandon, the committee had a decision that was going to tick off one fan base a lot. And I think they they struck a nerve with, I'll say, the majority of college football fans with this decision to keep Florida State out.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It doesn't. I get the argument for Alabama is you want the 4 best teams, and sure, but also that's never been what's happened. That's never been the case in this 10-team playoff. And frankly, I was kind of going to bed last night stewing over this some more, and I'm like, boy, aren't we lucky that it's been 10 years now, and this is the first opportunity that the College Football Playoff Committee has had to really screw things up. And they've really had their hands tied with every single year. Got kind of dicey in year one with a debate between Ohio State and TCU. You have to look at it. You have a one-loss Power 5 champion who had a tough loss early in the season, has since bounced back, and they look awesome right now. And then you have Ohio State, who, stumbled early, lost a quarterback early, lost their second quarterback early.
Mhm.
Does that sound familiar? Well, they ended up
Mm.
overlooking that scenario pretty conveniently. And to their credit, it worked out. Ohio State then
Mhm.
beat Alabama and won the national championship. They looked like one of the four best teams. They looked like the best team, to be honest with you, because they were given that opportunity. They took care of
Yep.
business in their conference, just like Florida State did. And yeah, I get it. You could make the case that Alabama's the better team because they would be favored if they were to play together. Oregon was favored by almost double digits last week. What happened to that?
Yep.
Washington, by the way, the 2 seed, has been underdogs in 2 of their last 3 games. So let's not
Yeah.
act like Vegas knows everything. Bama was a touchdown and a half favorite over Texas at home, lost by double digits. This is a
Sure.
17-point swing, 17 and a half point
Yeah.
swing at home. So that doesn't matter, right? Nobody gave TCU any chance last year against Michigan, and that flipped it. And also, by the way, another pet peeve, and I'm looking at you, Stephen A. Smith. Uh,
Ah,
People are using TCU as the prime example for, well, this
I've
is why you
noticed
want the
that.
4 best teams instead of the 4 most deserving teams. Hey, motherfucker, how about you start yelling at the committee by putting in a
Yeah.
team as fraudulent as Michigan last year, and maybe they would have beaten
Yeah.
TCU, and then we get a better national championship game. Let's start there. So it's crazy that people are much more angry at TCU for losing to Georgia than they are at Michigan for losing to TCU, but that's a side rant. Um,
It's a
this is
necessary side rant, I will say.
yeah, and on the flippity flop, if you do decide to put Florida State in, then you can point to on-field results being the indicator that, okay, well,
Mhm.
it's tough. Alabama has gotten a lot better. By the way, Alabama's not the only team that's gotten better since September, so I don't want to hear any of
Sure.
that.
Yeah.
Um, they're not the only team to improve over the season, so that's not everything. They did lose a football game, double digits at home. I didn't have time to do this, but I promise if you look through playoff year by playoff year, there's not many teams who lose by double digits at home and
Mhm.
get into the conference college football playoff.
Yep.
Alabama's a different beast. Whatever. But you have 3 undefeated Power 5 champions who took
Mhm.
care of business, and Florida State in particular, who scheduled 2 Power 5 conference opponents in
Mhm.
LSU and Florida. Now, I would argue that those aren't very strong games because the SEC stinks, but in the eyes of the College Football Playoff Committee, that should be such a gold standard. By the way, they beat one of those SEC teams with their backup quarterback. Um,
I
and
know.
they,
On the road,
on
too.
the road, and they've taken care of business, and they don't look as pretty without Jordan Travis. I get it, but they
Yeah.
also have taken care of business. They've still looked very like a very good football team, and a team that should at the very least be given an opportunity based on the field and everything that we've
Mhm.
based on the results of the games. Because also, here's the thing, Drew Russell. Let's say we're in a chess league. How do we determine who's the best chess player? By whoever wins the most games.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds right to me.
And all of a sudden now it's like, okay, well, we don't like Drew's strategy. So even though he's
Mhm.
undefeated and Brandon hasn't won a single game, we think there's a lot of promise here. We think he's gotten a lot better since the start of the chess season. We're gonna put him in the top 4 and give him a chance. That's not how it should be. And now, and we were talking a little bit before the show. It granted, it's never been great. It's never been a great system. It's always been kind of weird, well,
Mhm.
determining a national champion. But this system in particular stinks. It's always stunk. We've just haven't had the opportunity to really face the reality of the the bad system that we have in place.
Yeah. First off, I feel atrocious for the two backup QBs at Florida State because there's nothing. Look, they tried their best. Were they as good as Jordan Travis? No. But they won. They did what they needed to do with that position to win.
Yep.
And they're going to have that feeling probably the rest of their lives. And for that team, that senior class, when I hear, well, it doesn't matter, we're going to 12 next year. Tell that to those kids in person that you know what, it's just going to be different next year. They won't be around.
Yeah.
Maybe a couple will go pro. Most are going to have to go to the real business world or whatever they choose to do with their life. That's a tough feeling, especially 13-0 as a Power 5 team. And I think this viewed as a big deal because of bigger things at play, from television ratings, television networks, commercial revenue, amount of eyeballs they're going to be watching semifinal games. And there are people behind the scenes, and I'm not even saying this is wrong. They're thinking, hey, we put Alabama in there. Michigan, Alabama at the Rose Bowl is going to have more eyeballs on New Year's Day than Michigan, Florida State. Maybe that's true. I don't know. We'll never get to play both games and find out. But that is a BS reason to pull that. And I genuinely feel half the reason it was done, maybe more, Brandon, was because of the TV ratings. They cared about it. They were, people talk about that TCU deal from last year. Yes, it is pretty bananas that the two college football semifinal games had better television ratings than the college final. But at the same time, that's just how it played out. You're dead right. Michigan should have beat TCU. Pretty simple if they didn't want that to happen. TCU was more than worthy last year. They had a Heisman winner. I mean, they were great. They earned it in a Big 12 conference that has, powers across the board. Well, what about Oklahoma and Texas? That wouldn't have happened to Oklahoma and Texas if they had lost. They would have been like, wow, Georgia's just really great. They beat OU or Texas. But TCU, it's little TCU. That's just junk. And that's what's happened here is, you mentioned about the on-the-field results. It's a pretty dangerous message they're conveying. And I know 12 teams are going to come out next year. We still are not exactly sure how they're going to do this selection. But as Big 12 guys ourselves, am I concerned, Big 12 will get one representative in. What if we have a team that's finishes second, they go 10-2, losing their conference championship game, and the committee says, no, we're going to go with that fourth place SEC team that went 9-3 or 8-4. But, they were so close. That's the kind of circumstances you're building into because you just feel like, look, ESPN has a major deal with the SEC. So they have a financial incentive to get their big brands on TV to draw eyeballs. That this is the future NFL talent right here. You feel like they're picking teams based on recruiting rankings, Brandon, and future NFL draft picks more than what was watched on the field. That's what's the disappointing part about this. And I think not to sound like this is the end of the world, and it's not, but it just feels like we are setting some pretty wild precedents that could really get more out of hand. And I think that's why this has been such a national story.
Well, Andrew, I wouldn't worry too much about precedents being set here by the playoff committee because it's very clear they don't give a fuck about the precedents that they set. Because the precedents that they set, there's never been a Power 5 undefeated team to miss the college football playoff. That's the precedent they've set. They've set the precedent that you can even get into the college football playoff on your third string quarterback. There's a specific precedent that they set where that is the protocol. If you take care of business, we believe you're a good enough football team. So it's obviously that doesn't matter. But you're right. You're absolutely right. And you're very on with being skeptical. And that's the problem is that whether or not they're going to vehemently deny that it has anything to do with ratings or matchups or anything like that. And I probably believe them to a sense. But also there's some skepticism now where it's now there's other factors other than the on-field product determining who gets into the college football playoff.
Right.
And I think that the biggest evidence of that is that this isn't a world beater Alabama team, right? Like this isn't like a, like Oregon, I think would have had a good case, would have had a case over this Florida State team where they stumble early in the season and then they run through this tough schedule. They eventually lost. But Alabama hasn't been a world beater. And I guess they beat Georgia. And Georgia's best win this year is against Tennessee, who has a losing conference record. So I don't want to hear anything about that. But yeah, that is an impressive win. But like we kind of skimmed over that earlier, Alabama needed a Hail Mary play on 4th and 31 to beat Auburn, who's 6-6, barely made it to a bowl game. and got blown out by New Mexico State at home, if I'm not mistaken.
At
I
home.
can't
Yep.
remember.
Yep. At home.
Yep, I can't imagine they'd go to New Mexico State because that's the SEC doesn't do that. The SEC also has a losing record against the ACC, and I don't even think
Yep.
the ACC is that good of a conference.
No.
So, and they also have close wins against teams like South Florida, where they didn't look good. If you're going to talk about the eye test, why don't we talk about the eye test when they played South Florida or Auburn?
They should have watched the Arkansas-Alabama game. I sure watched that, Brandon. And Arkansas was as good as Alabama for 3 quarters. Arkansas was horrible this year.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, and it's just so crazy that they're selective with the eye test, because Oregon, outside of their game against Washington and then Texas Tech early in the season, they've run through their schedule. They look like the eye test would tell you they look like one of the best teams in the country.
Yep.
Granted, you can't have 2 losses. That's another precedent that's been set that they're choosing to follow, which is convenient. But Alabama does not have that impressive slate. They've skimmed by way lesser opponents, and they pulled it out, and they should get into a New Year's Six bowl. They've had a real good season. They've shown plenty of improvement, but it's just and you kind of touched on it here. It's very scary for the Big 12 because they're clearly showing a favoritism towards the SEC. And also not with this specific decision, but the Big Ten will also get a huge bump, adding those 4 teams next year. And you look at conferences like the ACC and the Big 12, and as is, and like, how can you call the ACC a power conference anymore? Because you have a team who went undefeated, went and played 2 of the SEC teams that are so great, and beat them. One with a backup quarterback who got knocked out, and then they had to finish the game with their 3rd string quarterback. And they took care of business, and that's still not enough over an Alabama team who lost by 10 points at home. And then even when the ACC collapses here in a couple of years, that's not going to – I think that gap between the Big Ten and the SEC is only going to get bigger from the Big 12 because, I mean, Clemson and Florida State, they're not going to go to the Big 12.
No,
so
you can't
it's a
envision
very
a
scary
scenario.
spot.
You can't envision a scenario unless Big 12 can get more media revenue, which, look, they have a new contract with ESPN, Brandon, and it's a good deal for the Big 12. Let's make that pretty clear. If they don't do that deal with ESPN, they're getting, around that 30, 35 million range a school, which is not bad. Then they might have turned into what the Pac-12 happened to the Pac-12, and they might be completely extinct. But the big thing is that, watching Alabama, Georgia ending on Saturday, this kind of famous because I do think it played a major contribution to helping the SEC rise from kind of more of a regional, it's big in the South, to more of a national brand was the SEC on CBS. And having that special 2:30 kick on a Saturday afternoon that any college football fan, shoot, even people who didn't maybe watch sports as not much, they're like, you tune on CBS mid-afternoon any Saturday, and you're always going to have football on, like, guaranteed. That helped build their brand. And when they did that montage of them leaving, and people talk about how good of a deal CBS got, only paying $55 million a year, I thought, but the SEC got a big, great deal too. They got this national exposure for 25 years. Yeah, do they leave money on the table or get ripped off from a financial standpoint? Sure. At the same time, that exposure, I think, that CBS gave them turned them into a just giant conference. They had some very charismatic coaches and players in the 90s, thousands, into the teens. And they were able to build a brand. Now SEC or ESPN is paying a remarkable amount of cash to have that exclusive #1 game of the week. And that because of that investment, Brandon, you do have to wonder a little bit. Is there, I hate conspiracy theories. I don't like going down this road. But is there, is a TV network compromised when they host, they're going to host all these championship games? Yeah, it helps their bottom line if there are more SEC teams in a playoff because that's the biggest investment they've made and they want to see a return on that investment. Unfortunately, most of it comes down to money, Brandon, and we're kind of seeing it unfold, and it's been a money deal for a lot of years. That's just how it is. That's college sports in general. you live with it. We still love it. We both know about the money circumstances. We both still love it. Millions still love it. But I think when the integrity of the game is put even into minor question, Brandon, that's when you get concerned as a fan.
Yeah, and we talked about this with players sports betting. There could be the best intentions in the world, but when you have that any bit of like valid skepticism, it taints everything. And yeah, this could very well be them genuinely just trying to get the 4 best teams in. I don't think it is, but it is, and I'll kind of go into that
Right.
here shortly. But you do kind of raise that question where, well, we can't leave the SEC out. Well, why not? The SEC stinks this year. Alabama lost by 10 points at home. Georgia couldn't even beat that team on a neutral site. And all
Mhm.
Georgia had to do was beat Alabama. They had cupcakes the entire season. Their best win
Yep.
is Tennessee, who couldn't win more games than they lost in their
Yeah.
8-game league
Yeah, I
season.
mean, their best. They've got one good win. It was Mizzou at home. That was
Yeah.
their
Oh,
one
yeah,
good
yeah,
win.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Mizzou's a better win than Tennessee, but
Yep.
regardless, when you have that taint, it just, and you don't have to have that taint because if Florida State gets in, you look at Alabama and say, well, you should have not lost by 10 points at home to a Big 12 team. You should have,
Mhm.
won all your games like Florida State did. And I get it. You can probably look at it and be like, well, if Alabama lost Jalen Milroe, their starting quarterback as a lacrosse player, so they probably take a dive. Florida State has depth, and they should be rewarded for that. They won football games with their second and third string quarterbacks, including on the road at Florida. Bad team, tough environment for sure, and then
Mhm.
playing Louisville, a top 15 team who's been very stingy this year. There's been no easy wins for them, and it's just so tough when you just have that. You have that as an option now. Is
Right.
it?
Again, it's just, and we talk about betting. That was very first episode. That was talked about when we were doing our preview. We were talking about Iowa State football. We were talking about the sports betting of that. We were talking about that integrity of the game. Look, sports betting, its rise nationally in the last 5 years is crazy. From it being more of a, hey, you want to do sports betting, you got to go to Vegas or you got to go to Atlantic City. And if you're going to do it in your local community, well, kind of that gray area where you find your kind of local guy,
Got
or
to know a guy.
you got to know a guy, or you go put your money through 3 or 4 different countries to bet in like Bangladesh. I mean, it's mayhem. And now we've seen kind of that mainstream where you can go on to any of them: DraftKings, FanDuel, BetMGM, you name it. They all got a sports book these days. It's legal in many states. And so, seeing on Saturday, I mean, ESPN Bet is a brand new service, Brandon. It's come out last couple months. It is a bit jarring just to see that and think, man, you're covering sports. How do you make sure you keep integrity from a journalistic side, from all that, while at the same time your company under the same umbrella is running a sports book or is in a partnership with a
Yeah.
sports book? And that is, I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, but it is something that's crazy to me. It's fascinating to me just watching all of this unfold. But change has not been easy when it comes to the history of college football. I mean, just to get to 12 teams, I think was viewed as a miracle. And maybe it was good that this happened this year to really force home the point. We probably do need more teams coming in for next year. But I mean, this is, again, just the amount of different roads this could go down. Where does the ACC, where does a Big 12, and where does everybody else stand going forward is going to be really interesting, because no one knows. And is that process being done right with no, like, hey, what is that criteria? No one seems to know anymore, Brandon. That's that's what's interesting.
Well, another pet peeve of mine for this whole process is, well, it's all about the 4 best teams. First of all, like I said, it's never been about the 4 best teams. It's not
Mhm.
ever what it's been like in this system. But if you want to put that as an argument, sure.
Mhm.
But do we really think that these are the 4 best teams? Do we really think Georgia's not one of the 4 best teams in the country?
Right.
I mean, a common argument I hear all the time is, well, if you put Florida State in, Michigan's going to be a 20-point favorite over them.
That's true.
Ooh,
Yep, I've heard that. Yep.
Georgia would be a 15-point favorite over Michigan.
Yeah,
Or 15's a lot. They would be a
they'd be a
favorite over
favorite. No
Michigan.
one debate
They would
that.
be a
Yep.
double-digit favorite over Texas or Washington by any stretch of the
Mhm.
imagination. Oregon was a 9-point favorite over the same Washington team just a week ago. These
Yep.
point spreads don't matter, but if you're really going to go, because the way I see it, and at least the agendas I'll be pushing, just to give you kind of an insight into that. If Florida State wins, then they should be they should claim a national championship. They should have gotten into the football playoff, and the committee should be executed for their crimes against college football. Or they lose to Georgia, and then it shows that Georgia is one of the 4 best teams in the country. They tried to get the 4 best teams in the country and couldn't even get that right, and they should be executed for their crimes against college football. So that's it. It's just it seems like they're really picking and choosing what rules that they said that they want to follow, which is insane to me.
Mhm. And that's the problem. Is again, we don't know. Look, if you want to look at just championship history, I'll give SEC its flowers right now, Brandon. This might be the only time this show. They do have the last 4 national champions. All right. If we want to be honest, that's a fact. LSU, 2019, Bama in the kind of weird COVID season. They win in 2020. Georgia the last 2. So, for the people that are defending the SEC saying, well, they deserve a shot because they've seen success recently. Okay. I mean, I can see that point because they have had success recently. You're not going to have me fight that. But I think those previous 4 seasons, LSU was an all-time great team. There was no debate. They were getting in. They were outstanding. Bama was outstanding in 2020 on that weird season. No one debated Georgia was made it the last 2 years. They were great. I mean, they deserved it. You don't feel like, admittingly, if Bama had not scheduled Texas, and you give those teams credit, if they scheduled just somebody random or a lesser Power 5 team and win, this wouldn't be a debate. They'd be 13-0. They would have had a weird deal of all these Power 5 champions at 13-0, and try to force Texas in there. Who knows? But the problem is that it seems they moved the goalpost on this selection compared to like every other one. And that's what's the weird and frustrating thing about it. But people have been confused a long time. It's taken a long time. I mean, just to get to 4 teams, Brandon, was a big deal. Back in 2012, when they were meeting, I dug a little research into it today. I mean, they were struggling with the idea of a 4-team, idea. Like they didn't know. They're like, well, they want to keep the Rose Bowl intact. They were trying to, like, the Big Ten in at Pac-10 or Pac-12. They wanted to make sure that stayed intact for a just tradition standpoint, and that's how it is. And that's unfathomable today. Like, traditions are off the windows these days. That's going to change all next year. I just know that people are confused right now. Florida State's confused, and there could be some mayhem where you have certain programs like a Florida State and Clemson. You mentioned Brandon, maybe Miami as well. Who knows? But I mean, for them, they're thinking, if the ACC is no longer viable, can we find a way into the SEC or Big Ten? I don't see it for right now, but we both know things can change rather quickly. And if an SEC feels they can make $1, and they said, let's extend an invitation to Florida State and Clemson, if they feel they can make more money, those 2 schools would accept that invitation a heartbeat. And that's just kind of how it is right now.
Yeah, and if I'm going to defend the college football playoff committee, I don't want to, but if I'm going to play devil's advocate here, the system's always been kind of fucked up when
Yeah.
you have, for a majority of college football history, where it's just, oh, who's the number 1 team in these polls? All right, well, you're the national champion. And then it seemed like they made some progress with the BCS, have the 2-team national champion there. And then, of course, now with the 14 playoffs. So it's always been kind of fucked up. And it's weird because in the past, I've defended the BCS system in the sense of nobody complained about the teams that got there. They complained about how many teams. We fixed that by creating the playoff, letting 4 teams in. But the selection system was still valid. That's also kind of weird this year because the BCS standings would have been Michigan, Washington, Alabama, and Florida State. So Texas gets left out. which is very weird. And I don't think that's right either. But you do, but in that sense, you go, well, there's more data points. We're using the AP votes that have more than 50
Mhm.
credentialed journalists whose job is more or less football and covering football. And it's still flawed. Then we have the computer system to kind of pick up that human error because these AP writers still can't watch every single game for every single team. So you have that, and it's a flawed system, but I feel like I would be less angry and less frustrated and less confused by the criteria if that's the system or a system like it, where there's just more data points and it's people who work in full time or work in football full time, not college administrators and former retired coaches who do this basically as a side gig. And it's hard to think, oh, these are athletic directors whose main job is money.
Mhm.
It's not their job isn't football. It's yeah, they pick the coach and they but it's money. It's setting the budget for the athletic department, bringing in revenue to the school, setting the hot dog prices at concession stands in their stadiums. Not who's the best football team in America. And so the system, while it's always been fucked up, this has always been a bad idea. And like I said to start the show, we're very lucky that it's taken them this long to really fuck something up like this.
Yeah, again, and you're dead right, Brandon. This is you look at the history and you're like, it's this like very slow progress. Um, the fact that they were still crowning co-national champions in the 90s is pretty wild because today that would not even remotely fly. Like fan bases would be furious if we just said, well, here's the deal. This year, Michigan and Washington are playing in the Rose Bowl. We've got Alabama and Texas. They're going to play in the Sugar Bowl. And that would be a situation where just based on those seedings, people would be complaining about what's that national champion, or with Florida State too. If Florida State was undefeated or is undefeated, excuse me, and they play, if it was a Big 12 team, I guess Texas. If it's Florida State, Texas, and let's say they meet down in Miami for the Orange Bowl, Florida State wins that game, and then Michigan wins their game, or Washington. They would have crowned those two national champions. That took me a minute, Brandon, but my brain figured it out.
There you go. It caught up.
It took me a minute. I was struggling there, but we got there. But that'd be awful. Like you're like, man, Florida State goes 14-0, Michigan goes 14-0. These two schools would love to probably have one definitive national champion, but hey, AP poll just says, well, congrats to both teams. Great season. We're going to crown in co-national champions, and that's what happened in the 90s. Then give them credit. They finally got all the bowls to buy in 98 and said, all right, now we're going to create a special national championship game. We'll keep the bowls in place. We're going to do a rotation of bowls. And for 8 years, one of the bowl games was the national championship game, led to maybe some of the best college football games of all time. When you look at just some of Texas USC is a famous one that's played at the Rose Bowl. Still the highest rated television game ever. But there were other nutso ones. Miami, Ohio State in the early time. To go to double OT, Miami fans are still furious. There were some great games. Nebraska, famous run in the early portion of that too. Had to give you a shout out, Brandon.
Yeah, shout out Huskers.
But
by the way, they got creamed in their only BCS national championship game appearance, which was the Rose Bowl, which, as I've mentioned a couple of times, if you're a fan of the program, still lost by less points to a historically great Miami team than Iowa did in their most recent Rose Bowl appearance against a very good Stanford team. Yeah, they were good.
It was Christian McCaffrey and a bunch of dudes.
Yeah. They were good.
Yeah.
Not a historically great national championship football team like Miami.
They didn't have what would that be? Clinton Portis, Santana Moss. Yeah. Those Miami teams were dirty.
Yeah.
Ooh. Man. Yeah. What happened to the U? Man, the U used to be pretty good. But again, for 8 years it worked out. Like nobody really complained the first decade. There were a couple weird instances. Auburn in 2004 went undefeated. They were left out. There were 3 undefeated teams that year. They didn't make it. Granted, they lost in their bowl game, so that doesn't matter. But it worked out well. Then we had the famed, ironically, the SEC involved again back in 2011 when people were furious when it was an Alabama versus LSU national championship. And that sparked the debate really serious debate of, are we doing enough here?
Yeah.
And that's what got, like, they were
Yeah.
struggling though. They were struggling with that though. And they said, all right, we'll go to 4 teams. You got us. And it was a major deal. People were ecstatic.
Yeah.
And, still to this day, Brandon, looking at the TV, television ratings, I mean, they were off the charts in that first, college football playoff in 2014. It was Ohio State, Bama, Florida State, Oregon. 28 million people apiece watched those semifinals games. And then Ohio State, Oregon had 34 million people watch, second highest rated watch in history outside of that USC Texans game in 05. That was the second highest. I was pretty surprised by that. On cable, too. Not even on network TV, on cable. That got 35, near 35 million people. And people were ecstatic. And I think for first 3 to 4 years, people were okay with how things were. Maybe the decision process was easy. The first year was actually the most controversial. You mentioned earlier, Brandon, with TCU and Baylor. But that was easier for the committee to write off because the Big 12 made a remarkable mess up and saying they're co-champions. And they're like, okay, we don't, they didn't know who do we pick out of these two? They're calling them co-champions, and that did lead that road to Ohio State. It's just, it's taken a long time to get to this point, but I think there are those instances, and people have hated change along the way. I was reading comments of the article about going to 4 teams. It was funny reading some of these comments, people saying, this is the death of college football, going to 4. This is ruining it. So, we've been down this conversation road many different times. Sooner or later, those people might be right, though. They're determined that this is going to ruin the sport or it's going to affect the sport. And this is a circumstance where there is concern on my end of what that looks like going forward.
Yeah, and Joel Klatt put this point out there that I think it is pretty fitting to kind of get into the heads of college football. The committee members is that they always pick the path of least resistance typically, and like even though that Ohio State team in 2014, you look at they're on their third string quarterback and this or that. They had a bad loss against a not so great Virginia Tech team early on in the season. But then if you don't put them in, then you have to decide between Baylor and TCU. And it's that kind of age-old argument where, well, Baylor won head-to-head, but then they lost to like a not-so great team also in their season. So their floor is lower, their ceiling's higher. And then TCU has a better resume, better strength of record because their only loss is to a really good Baylor team. You know what? Let's just go with Ohio State. And that kind of feels like it almost feels like that's the kind of path of least resistance is just picking the 4 best conference champions in their minds and going from there, which is not so great either.
It's not, and that's I think. Look, you hope you improve every year. You hope you can find systems that work and make sense. And it just feels like a team got absolutely ripped off for something that was out of their control. Yeah. / who knows what was going through things behind the scenes. Obviously, there have been plenty of detectives on Twitter, aka X, that I've seen the last few days that they're playing all these various different old clips. I just saw a College Game Day clip from 3-4 weeks ago before Jordan Travis got hurt. They're talking about scenarios, and this was the exact scenario that panned out. They said they had a Big Ten champion, Florida State, Washington, and they said, who's the 4th team between Texas, Alabama, and Georgia? If Alabama beat Georgia in the SEC championship. And Kirk Herbstreit, to a T, said, I'm not concerned. I'd be worried about Florida State. I don't know if they've got enough. And and that was before the injury, Brandon.
Yeah.
So you're thinking, again, this is conspiracy theorist to a T, but to go down that line of thinking, at the time, that wasn't even remotely thought. It was simple to me. It still is simple to me. Florida State goes undefeated. You got to give them a shot. You just feel like they've kind of earned that shot. No questions about it. And that's the difficulty of kind of seeing this pan out. And I've said this before about college football, Brandon. 12 teams is going to be great. I still am low key hurt. I love March Madness for one reason, and it's that every coach at the beginning of the season across the country, from Kansas and Kentucky to St. Peter's and Sam Houston State, can say, you have a chance to play for a national championship. Now, the path to get there is not easy, and the likelihood for those latter two schools are unlikely, but they can legitimately say that. In college football, you can't say that. You're a MAC team that goes 13-0. Well, you might get a Big Six bowl game, but you're not going to get a chance to compete for a national championship in this current formula. They might next year. I just don't, you know, I don't love that, to be honest with you. And you hope the 12-team playoff will fix some things. Obviously, if it was 12 this year, no one's going to debate as much about who was left out at, if they're ranked between 12 and 15. At this point, you're kind of like, who cares? You should have won an extra game or two. That's on you. But that's not the case.
Yeah, and just a couple of quick things to wrap up the playoff talk here. First of all, the real debate would be between who gets that group of 5 slot between SMU and Liberty. SMU with the lower record, but they schedule Power 5 teams. They should get in. Liberty undefeated, but actually the worst schedule in America. So it is what it is. But you're right. There would be a lot less outrage, and we wouldn't be here spending 48 minutes talking about SMU versus Liberty. But there is one possible funny thing to me about this scenario, and the last team to really have try to claim a national championship was UCF in 2017, led by head coach Husker legend Scott Frost.
Yep.
And I'm not in these circles, but I imagine that there were a lot of Florida State fans who were clowning UCF folks for trying to claim a national championship like that. And I'm sure that it would be pretty funny for Florida State to be in that same boat. But to kind of put a bow on this, I think the 12-team playoff absolutely would have been a huge hit this year. Because I think, one, obviously we're not excluding out an undefeated Power 5 champion, which is still ridiculous in a 4-team setup when you only have 3 undefeated Power 5 champions. But it is what it is. But I also think it elevates the conference championship games we just had last week. And Alabama and Georgia was a classic. That was an awesome football game.
It was.
I think that gets even – I still think that's as intense, maybe like 5% scaled down. But Georgia went from getting an extra week off and having a whole week off, and then in a perfect world would be hosting the second round at their stadium. I hope that they include that in the next round of the playoffs. In Commissioner Shanahan's system, they get a whole bye and they get to host a college football playoff game. And now they have to go play week 1 against a top 10 football team, probably the best team that they've had to play all year. Instead of sitting at home like Alabama is because they couldn't beat them, as they should. And then you have other games that probably weren't as consequential, like the Big 12 championship game, where Texas wins. They're in. If not, Oklahoma. Well, now in this setup, Oklahoma State's going to have an opportunity to make the college football playoff. And obviously, maybe Oklahoma State's not the best ambassador for this line of thinking, considering how they played down the stretch. But you have a team who, at new quarterback.
But give it incentive, is what you're saying. Give it incentive, and that's all we're asking.
You don't have to be perfect anymore. Like, you can, when you're replacing a quarterback like Spencer Sanders, you can stumble out of the gates and get it together, and then still be one of the best college football teams and still earn your way in. So every single college football conference championship game is gonna have that element where, even if it's a situation where it's Michigan and Eastern Iowa, where these two teams aren't on the same level, maybe a team pulls it out, and it adds that adds a level of madness to that we love about March Madness in college basketball, but not to the point where it washes down the regular season. So it would have been perfect. Everything that I've said about the college football playoff would be absolutely fantastic right now if they hired me as the commissioner of college football.
I'm all in. Commissioner Shanahan would be a hero already. This man, what would be your main slogan? What's your motto?
We love football. And that's the you would think that would be a given in these circles and these decisions, but it's not. And
Not anymore.
you hear people talk about for example, the whole keeping the clock running on first downs. That's not a football move. That's a money move. That's a commercial move. That's you're you,
Yeah.
you're implementing a rule that has less football. Now, I wouldn't go crazy with it, but every decision I would make would be what's best for college football, not what's going
Yeah.
to earn me a bigger bonus or what's going to earn Greg Sankey another boat in a lake house.
But then again, Brandon, I mean, you can have two homes, but imagine having a third home. Then, I mean, maybe your decision changes. Tough decisions have to be made. If you're like, man, just imagine if I could get this pool to this size. Just think about that. Because, I mean, Commissioner Shanahan, maybe, like in most executives, it's just money. Hey, show me the money. You get a larger cut, I get a larger cut too. But but I'm happy that you're not into that, Brandon. That makes me happy.
I love college football too much. I'd rather be cooped up in a studio apartment, but have college football be beautiful than be responsible for tainting the sport that America loves, that represents America. I think better than any other sport around. So that's a no brainer to me. Yeah, I'll tell you what, Drew. You can have the third house. I'll put in some overtime,
I could use
find
it.
some
I could use
find
it.
some new brand deals and get you a nice extra home.
I love the lake in the north in the summer. So if you're
Absolutely, we'll get you
looking
set
to
up
make
there.
that effort, but it's a wild deal, Brandon. There's no other way to put it. I think I was like, they won't do it. There's no way, right? They did.
I genuinely woke up on Sunday. I was like, boy, I was thinking crazy last night. I thought there was going to be a way where they don't put in Florida or Texas. Then I woke up. I'm like, no, that's ridiculous. They're not gonna fuck this up, and they did. They sure did.
Yep. No, they were looking for anything, and they got probably the exact nightmare they were hoping to
Yeah.
avoid. And they made their decision. And it's going to be interesting, just the fallout going forward from the sport. This offseason is going to be chaos. I mean, we'll probably talk more next episode just on the transfer portal is off the chains right now. What does this sport look like going into 2024? There's been some chaotic off seasons, and it's amazing just in the last 12 months how much this sport has changed, Brandon, where we feel like we've maybe got some solid footing. Or I remember going into the 2021 season and you're thinking, man, feels like solid footing. Everything seems kind of nice. And then all of a sudden, random press conference on a random summer day, Oklahoma and Texas are going to the SEC. And you're like, what? There's no way. And that's exactly what happened. It's like just been this wild snowball effect for the last 2.5 years. And it shows, I guess, the power of those programs and everything. But it's something new every single day. It really has been. It's been something new every single day. The sign stealing scandal at Michigan, that is like happened 5 years ago.
Yeah.
We forgot about that. Jim Harbaugh's a saint these days.
Yeah.
That's forgotten about, it seems, by everybody. And we got bigger fish to fry. So I think it's just been mind numbing the amount of stuff that's been thrown at a college football fan these last couple of years.
It's been nuts. And you know how bad you have to mess things up for us to go on a 55-minute vent session in favor of Florida State and Texas. You have to be pretty bad. But I'm glad that we got this vent session out. We've got a lot of good football to talk about here. Probably next week, we'll break down the bowls, transfer portal. I mean, the whole college football is going to look a lot different next week than it does this week. So I'm excited for that.
Yep.
I'm tinkering my bowl system to try to push anti-SEC propaganda. Going to bring that back out for another year. So it's going to be a good time. We'll do our bowl picks next time, and that's all I had. Anything else you want to hit on, Drew Russell?
Yeah, I think it'll be fun to go through those bowls. We've got, I think, nine Big 12 teams that have made it to a bowl game this year. So a lot of interesting content there. Want to give a shout out to the Dr. Pepper halftime scholarship throw, Brandon. Watched it in its entirety on Saturday in the Big 12 championship game. What content in regular throwing session was enough. Then the overtime throwing session was enough. And then somebody messed up the scoring on the one kick because I thought they're going backwards. And then I thought, I don't think he got they corrected. I thought, I don't think he got that many. And it looked like one kid got hosed out of, you're guaranteed to walk out there with 20 grand. But
that's not a bad deal.
That's not a bad deal. But
right.
The winner got 100,000. So I thought this kid, I think, just got cheated out of 80K. And that's give the Dr. Pepper credit for realizing the mistake, just giving both kids 100 grand. It was a very entertaining deal. So big shout out there on the Big 12 championship game. At number 3, Big 12 Hoops is continuing to deliver at a very high level. It's they've been great in non-conference play. Recent net rankings came out, which helps determine the March Madness bracket. My goodness, Big 12 is heavily represented in that. A lot of top 25 teams. And some big ones this week, at least up north, some interesting rivalry games. Mizzou and Kansas, they're back. That's always, those two schools hate each other, so that's always highly entertaining. And third is Iowa State, so can't beat it. Let's go Cyclones.